This video is an audio segment from the Fantasy for Real podcast, which should be able to be found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, but otherwise can be found in the link in the description. The main focus for this episode is breaking down my rookie rankings one final time before the 2024 NFL Scouting Combine. This video will cover the wide receiver position, and a video tomorrow will cover the quarterback tight end positions. The previous video on this channel is for the running back position. I do hope to steadily improve the quality of these videos, and I have seen at least one comment about using clips. I'm going to try to figure out how to do things like that, or things that can be more appealing visually. That said, I want to be honest, and I haven't been able to improve from the previous week's quality, the video quality at this point. So with that said, it's more of a audio podcast at this point with just some information in the background. So remember to like the video if you enjoy the content, and I've taken enough of your time. So on with the rankings. And then the wide receiver position is the position that is still by far the most fluid, and it probably should be the most fluid. You know, it's the position that the NFL takes 13 guys on in the top 50 picks, and only like 4 of them end up being good, or however that ended up going. It's just the way this position works. People target different people for different reasons. They believe in different archetypes. They believe that different archetypes can fit or fix their situations or fit with their quarterbacks for different reasons, and so it just is a hard position to grade because of all the things that come together at it. It's a position that, you know, you both find success by being good at everything, and a position that you find success by just being able to dominate at a couple things and being flawed depending on who you are. So by far the most fluid position, by far my most fluid rankings. My top 3, and the one that's a little bit different, my top 12, are the 2 tiers that are becoming the most clear. I'll get into it as I go, but I really do like to consider the top 3 as a tier at this point, specifically because, you know, I do feel individually different about each of them. And I don't just mean that as who they are as players, but I mean that from a rankings perspective, where I really do have it. Number 1, Marvin Harrison Jr. Number 2, Malik Neighbors. Number 3, Rome Odunze, in a very, very clear order like that, with about the same gap between each, which is not big, but is clear, if that makes sense. Some I have found to be lower on Rome Odunze, and there are some youth production things you could look at because technically he did not produce in his sophomore year. But here's one thing I'll say about that, and this is kind of the reason why I look at things holistically and not by raw black-white correlations, because, you know, you can only map certain things on, you know, whatever variable you're studying. And I know all this stuff kind of sounds silly, but if we're going to say that 1 year is important, how young or old you are in that year is important too, even if it can only be different by a few months. And, you know, anyone who's gone to school understands fundamentally that within a school year, people get different age at different points. You know, there are people who are much older in the grade and people who are much younger in the grade. There are people who graduate, or there are people who turn 18 before the school year starts. There are people who turn 18 after they graduate and graduate at 17 years old. And my point in saying all this is that Rome Odunze and Marvin Harrison Jr. are these 2 extremes. Rome Odunze graduated high school at 17 years old. Marvin Harrison probably turned 18 years old before he started his final year, and that is why Rome Odunze is only 3 months older than Marvin Harrison, despite being in college for 1 more full year, 2 or 3 months. And so the big key in saying all that is the months don't matter. What matters is that if you're going to look solely at youth production, Rome Odunze had more of it than Marvin Harrison before those early years, because he was starting at an earlier age, and because, you know, Marvin Harrison Jr. didn't do very much that first year with other players on his team, you know, keeping him on the bench with Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Chris Olave all at the same time being on that Ohio State team. Now, of course, he has the excuse for the no early production. That's not my point. My point is that if you're going to really worry specifically about early production in regard to Rome Odunze, it's worth knowing that Rome Odunze had more receiving yards before turning 20 years old than Marvin Harrison Jr., who didn't even have 200 receiving yards before turning 20 years old. So it feels odd saying this because Troy Franklin, at the beginning of doing my deep dives, which was 2 shows ago on this next 4 wide receivers, I had him at 5, and now I both feel like he's at 4 and potentially maybe separating a little bit. And I think my concern with Troy Franklin is that I do try to rank things for Devy leagues or for leagues where prospects could potentially be tradable assets. Because regardless of how many listeners may play in those leagues are the only ones where you have to actually make determinations. And so for that reason, and then just for the general sake of it, I really don't like yo-yoing people up and down my rankings. So when I think that certain players might get drafted far, far, far higher than a player, I sometimes do push that player up, or when I'm worried that a player might be falling a little bit down, I push that player down. But the buzz has constantly been better and better and better with Troy Franklin, and I've always liked the analytics a little bit better, and I liked him on the film review a little bit better than I initially remembered, or however you want to phrase that. My reevaluation came away higher on Troy Franklin, and so because he does separate himself so well analytically from the other guys that I put in the same tier as Troy Franklin, and because Troy Franklin does seem to be getting a little bit more NFL draft buzz, he does seem to be somewhat separating himself as the wide receiver 4 to me. There's something interesting about my next two guys, in Keon Coleman and Brian Thomas Jr., that there's something about them that they feel like they might belong in a tier with Troy Franklin to me, and they feel like they might belong in a tier with A.D. Mitchell to me, but A.D. Mitchell and Troy Franklin don't feel like they belong in the same tier to me. And I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else, but at least they're in the middle, so it makes a little bit of sense. But the whole point in what I'm getting at here is that those are guys that I could see buying into the idea that they are not as safe necessarily, though Troy Franklin has his own issues with safety when you consider just his general size, but that they have the overall ability with the risk and the upside to be just as valuable as Troy Franklin. Whereas I could also talk myself into the idea that the scary things, the things that I'm worried about in their profiles, drive them down to the point where they're closer to A.D. Mitchell, a guy who has talent, but has a lot of unproven talent, with, some of that being the injury in the second year. But at the end of the day, A.D. Mitchell is someone who's sliding just a little bit for me, hasn't fallen out of the wide receiver 7 spot. But it's hard when you're doing a deep dive on a profile as someone who believes in the analytical things to see all the numbers and them not be that good, right? I don't fully endorse this logic because I think you can get really subjective into, when you're making arguments and when you're not. But I do think the most when I'm thinking about A.D. Mitchell back to a time this offseason where Daniel Jeremiah said something about the players that you find yourself making the most excuses for are sometimes the ones that you just got to say, maybe it isn't this guy. And that is the conflict I have with A.D. Mitchell right now. There's a lot of things I like because as someone who follows college football, it seems like the people around college football have thought he's extremely good, and not just extremely projectable, but extremely good, that he can do things for teams at any point in time because of his ability, say, in the red zone. And so that is why I am still high on A.D. Mitchell. That is why I still have not moved him out of wide receiver 7, but he is a player who I am asking myself questions about. And the two players who are challenging him the most would not be the player who I last ranked at wide receiver 8, because that is Xavier Worthy. And as I mentioned in that show, wide receiver 8 was a very conflicting place for me because I really started with him lower down that list and I ended up with him at wide receiver 8 and I didn't know how I felt about it. And there's so many things analytically, just looking at his freshman year, that make me think that Xavier Worthy should stay at 8. But I don't really love what he's done the last 2 years. I don't love the production. I don't even really like the production because the production, it's fine, but it's also fine coming really strongly off of screens, swings, and simple one-read passes where he just took the ball and ran. And the reason that I worry that I'm ranking him too low and why he is still in my top 12 wide receivers, which again is my biggest tier break outside of the top 3, is because of the speed, the potential to run around a 4-3, the ability to extend plays after the catch. These are things that I do think Xavier Worthy could at least potentially do right away at the NFL level. But that profile needs to be able to win downfield, and I'm not sure he can. I'm not sure he can at anything that is close to a contested catch point, and I'm not sure he can with I'm worried about him getting jammed up in those first 5 yards. And so Xavier Worthy is a player that has probably my biggest overall red flag, because while it isn't an objective red flag, it's the thing I worry about the most. So I guess that's just the way to put it. So going back to it, the two players who are actually challenging A.D. Mitchell for wide receiver 7 are Jalen Polk and Roman Wilson. Those are two guys I like quite a bit. There are a couple things I don't love about their profiles, but there are a lot of things I like about their traits, and they've done enough at the college level that make me really feel like I can buy into those traits. So Jalen Polk, Roman Wilson, those guys round out my top 9 wide receivers, with the 5 to 9 being kind of the most fluid tier where I really don't know what I'm doing with any of these guys, but I do think that's my 5 to 9 in some order, with Keon Coleman, Brian Thomas Jr., A.D. Mitchell, Jalen Polk, and Roman Wilson. So the last 3 guys up for me in my top 12, and there are some controversial players being left out, obviously, and I'll talk about those. But the solid tier of top 12, the 3 last players I'm really feeling good about, or, obviously to an extent, because the first one is Xavier Worthy, who I just talked about. The other 2 are Malachi Corley out of Western Kentucky and Malik Washington out of Virginia. If I had to guess between the 3 who I'm leaning to right now to lead this trio of this kind of last tier of 3 in my top 12, it is Malachi Corley, because the other 2 do have a red flag in their physical makeup. All 3 of these guys, what really makes them similar is that they're all guys who I see something that translates at the next level, but I'm not sure I see enough that translates at the next level to believe that they are high volume guys. But between something in the analytics or something that they do really, really well, probably more in Malachi Corley's case, I do still like them a good bit in this top 12 range. These are frankly 3 players that I'd be really excited to get on my NFL team. I almost said especially Corley and Washington. I don't know if that's true or not, but that kind of does say where my headspace is right now with Xavier Worthy. But anyway, my point being, Malachi Corley is the one that I would favor because he doesn't have a size red flag, whereas Malik Washington is 5'8", and Xavier Worthy is extremely lean. Malachi Corley, and not only that, but Malachi Corley is an extremely good athlete, both in terms of being well-rounded and being explosive on top of the well-roundedness. He did weigh in at 215 pounds at the Senior Bowl, which I believe I had at like 85th percentile weight or something around that range at this point at the NFL game, at least when I looked it up at the time. I'm not sure. It's been a while, so I don't know if that percentile is right, but I do know he was 215 pounds at the Senior Bowl. So that's a big guy, especially for, being able to move as fast as he can as a yak receiver. So those 3 round out my top 12. Oh, and Malik Washington, if you would have asked me before the draft, or before my rankings, how do I profile players to find sleepers, I would have never assumed that my answer would have come down to looking for older players. But I will say objectively that the players I'm finding that I am the highest on compared to the market as of today are Ray Davis and Malik Washington, who are 2 very old players that do have very concerning things in their profile, but I really like the upside both possess, even as small as Malik Washington is. This is a guy who had almost 50% of his college team's production in the passing receiving game last year, and then the year before he actually had a sneaky high percentage of his team's passing production because it was a low volume Northwestern team. I go into that more in the Malik Washington is Rising show. That is the 3rd show I released, I believe. So if you want to dig deeper into Malik Washington, but the 2 players that I believe will get me the most flack and are my top 2 honorable mentions, and that's not for the same reason necessarily, but are Ladd McConkey and Tez Walker. Ladd McConkey, I do have some concerns with. He profiles very differently than Roman Wilson to me analytically because of the differences in their offenses are not things that I think a lot of people are just brushing aside the differences in the Michigan and Georgia offenses in their peak years because of the fact that they both dominated teams and won national championships. And I get that, but Georgia won those games by throwing the crap out of the ball, and Ladd McConkey didn't get many of those yards. Michigan won those games by really, really methodically taking their time and being extremely slow with the ball. And if you want a statistical representation of this, my own numbers show that in his 700-yard season, Ladd McConkey was at around 17% of his team's proportional production in the receiving yard category. And in his peak season this past year, Roman Wilson was at 25%. That's a substantial difference between the two, and why Ladd McConkey has a red flag there that Roman Wilson does not. Aside from that, while the standard size profiles would favor Lad McConkey because he's a little bit taller, the Senior Bowl measured in his arms at 30 and 1/8 inch. I will cover the combine stuff, the specifics in the combine stuff in the weeds a little bit at the end, but that is a size that concerns me, especially for a guy where the very first note I wrote is he inside or is he inside outside versatile? Because if he's only inside, that's obviously a concern. And 30 and 1/8 inch arms are inside arms. That doesn't necessarily mean he will play inside. He does have a very good ability to, stop, start, and gear shift. And in certain leagues, maybe even playing primarily inside will be good for his PPR floor. But at the end of the day, you are targeting from a draft perspective either outside players or inside outside versatile players. You're rarely targeting players who you think are only going to play in the slot. And, Malik Washington might be a little bit of that, but I would rather bank on the guy with 47% of his team's production than 17. And I understand it's not that simple, but to me, the whole point of production and at the wide receiver position is that you use your traits to win and you use your traits to prove things and you use your traits to prove things over time. Lad McConkey has traits that I like, but has he proven things with them over time? He has not. Not to the extent that I look for. So that is why he is an honorable mention and not in my top 12 wide receivers. And then Tez Walker is one of those guys where I was really excited for him. I really didn't like what the NCAA did, in terms of with his eligibility. But at the end of the day, I think he got a lot of credit for his really exciting games and did not get enough flack for the games where he kind of disappeared. And at the end of the day, it is more of a traits thing. I'm worried about how he decelerates. I'm worried about how he gears down. So he's an older prospect, 23-year-old prospect, concerned about some of the traits things, didn't have a great Senior Bowl, concerned about some of the numbers things. So Tez Walker does have the size, does have the speed. Some people were worried that he measured in at 6'2", going back to the arm length thing. His arm length was really, really nice. And since I do favor that measurement slightly to height, Tez Walker's size doesn't bother me at all. It has nothing to do with being under 6'2". I actually think his profile in that regard with his speed is going to be exceptional on my lists, but he is the honorable mention number 2 to me. There's obviously a lot more players. Some of those get discussed in my wide receiver 8 through 15 show, which was the 4th show I did. So if you're interested in a few more players, keep an eye out for that. I profiled Javon Baker on the last episode, so keep an eye out for that. But that is about all I have for this wide receiver position. And the only thing to add, and I should recap it really quick. So, first tier, Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze. Tier break, I do think Troy Franklin is separating himself just a little bit from the pack, but 4 to 9 or 5 to 9 is very fluid with me, with Keon Coleman, Brian Thomas Jr., A.D. Mitchell, Jalen Polk, and Roman Wilson wrapping out those 9 wide receivers there. And then after that, you have Malachi Corley, Xavier Worthy, and Malik Washington really rounding out the biggest tier that I have in my top 12, with Lad McConkey and Tez Walker being the honorable mentions outside of that list. And that's it for this clip of the Fantasy for Real podcast. If you're looking for more on the podcast, I also discuss some value points for NFL players like Jordan Love and Tyjae Spears, and briefly discuss the NFL Scouting Combine and its importance, or at times lack thereof. So if you like the video, make sure to hit the like button and consider listening to the show if you're someone who listens to podcasts. That would mean a lot to me. Most weeks I have an episode out every Monday and Thursday, though the schedule is subject to change, and I hope to see you next time.